Hello, everyone. My name is Beth Quillian, and I'm a Public Information Officer for ODFW, and I'll be moderating the meeting today. We're just going to give it a few minutes to allow people to join, and then we will get started. Just as we wait, a couple housekeeping things. We will be using the Q&A function for today's meeting, so if you have a question, you can go up to the bar at the top of Teams and click on Q&A. And you can start a discussion and type your question in there. And when we get to the Q&A portion, I will go through all of the questions that are in there. But again, we're just going to give it a couple more minutes to allow people to join, and then we'll get going. We'll give it just another minute here. But as people join, again, we'll be using the Q&A feature today. You should find that at the top of Teams. You can type any questions into that Q&A box, submit them, and we will get to them once we get to the Q&A portion of the presentation. But it doesn't look like anybody else has joined in the last couple minutes, so we can get started. But to introduce myself again, I'm Beth Quillian. I'm a Public Information Officer for ODFW, and I'll just be helping moderate today's meeting. But with that, I will kick it over to Michael to get us started.
All right. Thank you, Beth. Appreciate you helping us out here today. And thanks everyone for joining us for this update to ODFW's sage grouse conservation assessment and strategy update. So the plan is in draft form, and this is our first kind of kickoff to introducing this to the public outside of our kind of, team that's been working on the plan. So we're excited to share this with you. We are really interested in your feedback. And at the end of the presentation, we'll remind you where you can provide that feedback. And also, I would like to introduce my co-presenters. So we have Skylar Vold, who is our sage grouse conservation coordinator over there in Hines today. And we have Greg Jackal, who is our sage grouse mitigation coordinator. And so they'll all be presenting their various chapters today. So with that, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Our plan is to walk you through the document and also kind of our thought process as we went through and updating this ODFW sage grouse plan is how I want you to think of it. Which was last updated in 2011. So a lot has happened in the sage grouse world since 2011. A lot of science, a lot of maturing in the way that we think about how to manage these birds, and also ODFW's role in that has also matured. So it was time to update this plan, and so here we go. You should have seen, hopefully, the slide change there. So the first section is really just kind of setting the stage. So when we initiated the revision, it was tricky because since 2011, the Oregon Sage Grouse Action Plan was adopted. And that was the statewide plan that kind of came down from the governor's office when we were very concerned about the listing of the bird in 2015. The action plan incorporated a lot of the themes from the 2011. You might hear us refer to this plan as the CAS, the Conservation Assessment and Strategy. So if I say CAS, that's what I mean, and we're talking about this document. And so the action plan kind of made the CAS a little bit obsolete because it incorporated a lot of the content. But we were still lacking a current document today that describes ODFW's specific management approach and our responsibilities. So we went through and asked ourselves, well, what is ODFW going to do for sage grouse? What are our responsibilities? And those were spelled out actually in the 2015 action plan. And that's what we used to craft our document. And we boiled that down to what you see on the slide in front of you as 7 main points. And that allowed us to outline the new document based on those things. And this is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to cover each of these points just at kind of a high level. But I will remind you that the draft document is available chapter by chapter on our website. So if you tune out from here and don't pay attention to the rest of the document, here's what we really want you to take away from today's presentation. The CAS tiers to the action plan. And so again, this is ODFW's slice of the sage grouse management pie. But sage grouse management happens on a very broad scale with a lot of partners. We are bringing on board a new population model and also some new LEC definitions. Skylar will talk about that. If you've been engaged in this process, you will know that we were able to update our habitat maps back in December of 2023. So those maps will live on in this document. We are updating our population and habitat objectives. We are also getting on board with threat-based strategic conservation. It's kind of a paradigm shift in how we prioritize our work on the ground. LIT governance. So the idea of LITs was sort of hatched in the 2011 version of this plan, but then it was adopted by the action plan. And so LIT governance has shifted more. When I say LIT, that's a local implementation team, sage grouse local implementation team. And so we all agreed that, the boots on the ground, like the decisions at the local level need to be made by the experts who know that area the best. And so that happens in the forum of the LITs. And SageCon has taken kind of governance over those LITs. ODFW is still very much an active participant and help inform those groups. I apologize if I'm using acronyms that you're not familiar with. I guess I'm assuming that we've got some background in sage grouse conservation here, or you've been in the realm. But SageCon is kind of the governor's level collaboration group, the Sage Grouse Conservation Partnership. And then mitigation was not part of the 2011 plan because we didn't have those rules in place until around 2015 as well. So that's a new chapter in this version of the document. And then I'm also happy to report that we're providing some best management practices for things like translocation, trapping and marking. We're providing a position statement on captive rearing. So those are the big things that you'll see as I see as major improvements and updates to this document. So a couple slides on section 2, which is where we look back at the science that has happened. A lot has happened since 2011, and try to describe how we apply that knowledge to the threats that are facing our sage grouse. So we've updated the document to include hundreds of new scientific references, and the hard part is figuring out how to turn those into management recommendations. And what's true is the science upholds the fact that sage grouse habitat is deeply impaired from the overstory to the understory at both the small and the large scale. Invasive annual grasses are the dominant threat on the landscape. They spread after fires, but they also spread after really any kind of disturbance. And we have funded research that shows sage grouse are not particularly adaptable to the post-fire landscape, and we know that our fire landscape is very altered for a lot of reasons, including invasive annual grasses, as well as drought, climate change. Just a lot of things are encouraging fire on the landscape. We have also funded research that showed that we get a really high demographic response rate to conifer removal. And so that was really important research that came out of Oregon. We have been in a mega drought for about 22 years. And the research shows that sage grouse population growth rates are linked to previous year precipitation. There was a huge study out of Idaho that looked at grazing, and that responsible spring grazing really doesn't have an effect on sage grouse demographics. But other research is showing that when our free roaming equids are above appropriate management levels, they definitely do impact our sage grouse populations. Fragmentation, of course, is a huge issue. Everything from development to roads, mining, energy, all of the footprint of humans on the landscape creates corridors for predators to hunt, perching structures, avenues for weeds. And this all leads to reduced nesting rates, nest success, brood survival, adult survival, all of that. So not painting a really pretty picture here, of course, but what's really important is how we prioritize, addressing these threats. And we're very grateful for some research that has come out in the last decade, starting with the sagebrush conservation design, which identified the most important sagebrush habitats on the landscape, really range wide. And it was really pretty remarkably precise. And then a group of our Oregon researchers took that a step further and developed the concept of threat-based land management, which incorporated all of these new remote sensing products and took into account things like resistance and resilience on the landscape and the sagebrush conservation design to classify sage grouse habitat as core, growth opportunity, or contain. And so you might have heard the motto, defend the core, grow the core, mitigate impacts. And that's what we're doing here. We are first prioritizing defending those most important core habitats and then growing them out while protecting them from the most impacted landscapes. And so we have to prioritize the way that we do work out there. And so this gives us a framework to begin doing that. And the next step in all of this is to really actively prioritize sites and locations in Oregon's sage grouse range that are going to have the best return on our conservation investments. So now I'm going to hand the presentation over to Skylar, and he's going to cover the next couple sections.
All right. Section 3 of the CAS details Oregon's sage grouse population monitoring efforts and reports sage grouse population trends. So, coordinating the annual monitoring of Oregon's sage grouse populations and reporting population trends is a primary responsibility of ODFW's game bird program. The largest change in Section 3 from the previous version of the CAS is ODFW's transition to an updated sage grouse population model, which we contracted with USGS to develop. And there are three key differences between ODFW's previous model and the new population model. So first, the new model accounts for imperfect detection of male sage grouse attending leks, including variation in detection probability during a given survey, within a survey season, or among survey seasons. So for example, the time of day at which a survey is conducted will influence the lek observer's ability to detect sage grouse, where the highest detection rate is at sunrise. Second, the new model accounts for variation in male attendance. So research has shown that the daily attendance rate of males to leks is about 0.58, which is now reflected in our new model. Lastly, the new model accounts for presently unknown leks on the landscape, using the history of our lek searches to date, which the previous model did not account for. Other notable updates to Section 3 include an update to ODFW's lek monitoring protocol, updated lek conservation status definitions, and the addition of pack scale trend analyses. PACs, or sage-grouse priority areas for conservation, are what ODFW considers the biologically significant unit for managing these populations. All right, so the figure on this slide shows Oregon's statewide estimate of sage-grouse abundance, where estimated true abundance is on the y-axis and years on the x-axis. This model requires repeated surveys to generate population estimates, and the time frame which has an adequate sample size of repeated surveys is 2017 to the present. So we were able to back calculate the statewide population estimates to 1980 using the population estimates from the previous model and the new model during this 2017 to 2024 timeframe, and then predicting those estimates back to 1980. This process is all detailed in the draft of Section 3 language, which is available on our webpage if you're interested in reading more about this calculation. The figure on this slide shows Oregon's statewide estimate of sage-grouse abundance from 1980 to 2024, where again the estimated true abundance is on the y-axis and years on the x-axis. This top line shows the estimates from the new model, and the bottom line shows the estimates from the previous model. So you can see that our new estimates are approximately 20,000 to 25,000 birds higher than the previous estimate. And again, the main reason we see higher estimates under this new model goes back to those differences between the two models. The new model accounts for variation in detection probability, variable male attendance to leks, and presently unknown leks on the landscape. In previous versions of ODFW's conservation assessment and strategy, the statewide goal for our sage-grouse population was set at the 2003 level as the baseline between a trough and a peak in the population cycle. During the current update to the CAS, we kept 2003 as the baseline year and updated the population goal to reflect the population estimate under the new model, which you can see here in this figure. Our update to Section 3 also includes a pack scale trend analysis, which we were able to complete using abundance data from the USGS range-wide lek monitoring framework. Remember, packs are sage-grouse priority areas for conservation. These are the biologically significant units for managing these populations. The left figure on this slide shows the abundance index of sage-grouse counted through time in the Steens pack. Note, this is not the estimated true abundance as I showed in the previous graphs. Rather, this is an index of abundance, which generally relies on male counts. So you can see that the Steens pack has been nearly stable from 1996 to the present, which is what we'd like to see for all of our sage-grouse populations in Oregon. Trends are analyzed from trough to trough in the population cycle. So for example, from 1985 to 1996, the population trend was about 0.6. So we saw a 40% decline in the sage-grouse population in the Steens pack during this time frame. However, from 1996 to 2008, the population trend was 1.05, so we saw a 5% increase in the population in the Steens pack during this time frame. These proportional changes in the abundance index between troughs of the population cycle are what the panel on the right of this figure shows. So our recommendations from Section 3 are to update the sage-grouse population goal and management objectives in OAR 635, Division 140, Rule 5. ODFW will manage sage-grouse to maintain or enhance their statewide distribution and abundance, oscillating around the 2003 population level, approximately 53,000 birds over the next 50 years. Additionally, ODFW will manage populations to maintain stable or increasing population trends statewide and at the pack scale. Population trends, again, are assessed among naders or troughs in the population cycle. As you can see here, these are all naders or troughs of these cycles, and we know that through research from USGS that this is the most appropriate way to assess population trends. All right, so jumping into section 4. Section 4 of the CAST details ODFW's process for mapping Oregon's significant sage-grouse habitats. The significant habitat map is used to help cite conservation and restoration activities for sage-grouse. It's also used by ODFW's sage-grouse mitigation program, and this map applies to the Department of Land Conservation and Development's Goal 5 land use rules, both of which Greg will discuss in Section 7. Our update to Section 4 details the framework for mapping significant sage-grouse habitats, which includes the modeling phase, boundary refinement, and partner and public input. We also added a detailed appendix outlining the habitat model. Recommendations from Section 4 are to maintain a map of significant sage-grouse habitat reviewed on a 10-year basis, coordinate closely with DLCD on any future map updates, and ensure a robust partner and public review process for future updates to the habitat map. The most recent update to ODFW's significant sage-grouse habitat map was undertaken as a part of the larger conservation assessment and strategy update. The process was started in 2022, and the final map was taken to the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission in December 2023, where it was approved. In January 2025, the Land Conservation and Development Commission, LCDC, adopted the updated map into OAR 660, Division 23, Rule 115, which is DLCD's Greater Sage-Grouse Rule. This update replaced the deprecated 2011 and 2015 maps. And that's all that I have for Sections 3 and Section 4.
Okay, thank you, Skylar. All right, we're making good progress here. Section 5, we're going to talk about ODFW's responsibilities as far as monitoring our sage-grouse habitat. And just like with the population objective, we do have a habitat objective in OAR, which I've summarized there on the left-hand side of the slide. So the previous rule, which is actually currently active, states that we're going to manage for a minimum of 70% sagebrush habitat in advanced structural stages, with an emphasis on the later class of structural stages. And we're also going to manage those habitats on a smaller level by BLM district, including the Baker Resource Area, and then the rest of the Vail District, Burns, Lakeview, and Prineville. And so that's the previous rule. We are proposing to make a switch to using what's known as threat-based eco-states. And so that comes out of the threat-based land management that I mentioned in Chapter 2, in Section 2. Of those eco-states, we feel like A, B, and A-C represent the habitat that we want to see on the landscape for sage grouse, and we would like to see that happening at least 70% coverage at both the statewide and the PAC levels. Why 70%? Why not 100%? We all know that that's really too much of a pie in the sky. We're constantly losing sagebrush habitat to fire and conversion, various reasons. But we do know that at 70%, as shown in this graph, you have a very high probability of persistence of your sage grouse populations if you've got 70% coverage. And that goes down as you move to the left on this graph. So it's a good guideline, and it's also approximately where we were when we felt like our sage grouse populations were a little bit more stable. So how are we doing? So in this graph, you can see I've highlighted in yellow those eco-states that we're proposing to include in the rule, A through C, and B. And then you'll see what did it look like in 1990, and then 2003, and then 2023. Remember that 2003 is where we've set our population objective, and so that's kind of why we've split things up this way. So back in 1990, and also I would like to point out this graph is specific to core habitat. It doesn't include low density. It's just an example of how things are going out there on the landscape. And you've probably noticed that we've lost a lot of our state A habitat since 1990. Back in 90, we were sitting at 84.4% of those highlighted categories, which far exceeded the 70% that we're proposing. In 2003, when our population objective is set, we saw a huge decline actually in state A, and an increase in that intermediate conditions shrubland and grassland. But we were still at 74.3% of those highlighted categories. But now in current day, state A has continued to be replaced by intermediate shrub, poor condition grass, and now we're down to 60.3% approximately in core. And if we were to look at low density, it's actually closer to 50%. And altogether about 57% of the habitat categories that we would like to see up to 70%. Hopefully that makes sense. What does that look like on the map? Obviously, different parts of the state are altered in different ways. And so here you can see our both core and low density. The low density is the hatched portion of these maps. And so you have 1990 on the left, 2003 in the middle, 2023 on the right. And, you know, you can probably recognize some past fire scars there, which were, you know, then taken over by invasive annual grasses, that sort of thing. And there's also been 20 years of drought since that 2003 map. So, so very serious impairment out there on the landscape. And we have talked about what those threats are out on our rangelands. And so, you know, I will start off by saying that we have to break these down into local problems, local issues that require local solutions that are going to come from our LITs. And so we need to support those LITs and make sure that ODFW is at the table because we do have local experts who know this area really well and can lend expertise as well as, you know, leverage some funding or capacity, that sort of thing. Again, we are advocating for the use of threat-based land management techniques, which involve first protecting the most important core habitats and then growing them while protecting them from incursion. And you know, just emphasize that we have to prioritize our work on the ground with the limited resources that we have, and also monitor the effectiveness of our actions out there, which ODFW can do by measuring the demographic response of our birds to treatments. Section 6 is about cooperation and collaboration, which I really only have a couple of slides for, which doesn't represent the huge part that this plays in sage grouse management. ODFW does not manage really much of the land where sage grouse live, but we really do need to be at the table as subject matter experts. Like I said, we do have experts in our field with a lot of local knowledge we can plug in at all levels to provide that capacity and resources, investing in research. And so here I've just listed some of the ways that we're already showing up in our partnerships. And again, as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, I do want to highlight the change in 2011 from in the LIT governance. In 2015, the action plan picked up on the LIT idea and expanded it to include more than just land managers. And really at this point, things were out of our hands, though we continued to try to stand up the LITs. But since SageGone has really stepped up to provide some leadership there, that has breathed some life into these groups. And you know, we will continue to provide direction and financial support, and again, be those subject matter experts. while we may not be directly supervising, say, the positions of the coordinators. So with that, I'm going to hand the presentation over to Greg, who's going to cover the mitigation part of things.
All right. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, just a brief update. My name is Greg Jackal. I'm kind of filling in this role from, I was the Prineville District Wildlife Biologist, and I'm working as a sage grouse mitigation coordinator in kind of a temporary role. So I've learned a lot this last year, and I've worked, well with Skylar and Michael and a lot of the partners. And so I just kind of wanted to throw that out there. It's been a learning journey for the last year, and diving into the mitigation rules and the HQT and everything. So I'm gonna go over those and quickly in about 5 slides. So one thing that's important, that this process identifies is we didn't have a mitigation program identified in 2011. So that's a kind of an important component to the new CAS update. In 2011, if a developer came to ODFW or the BLM and wanted to do a project in sage grouse habitat, oftentimes we would tell them, it's Category 1 habitat. You have to avoid all impacts. And so, we had some interim guidance, and then worked on, like most of the Western states in that time frame between 2011 and 2015, to develop basically a sage grouse mitigation program that was acceptable to developers, land use programs across Eastern Oregon. And so we did that. A lot of work. Probably the folks that are on this call. SageCon was pivotal. Nature Conservancy worked on devising that first habitat quantification tool, which is largely what we use when we identify debits from projects that are going to impact sage grouse habitat. So I think Fish and Wildlife Service really looked at Oregon's plan, and it was kind of a guiding, it was really assuring to them that we had a program in place to deal with development, large scale development. Fortunately, in that time from 2015 to 2025, we haven't seen a lot of large scale development in sage grouse habitat. I think it's kind of coming, but we've been able to kind of prevent large fragmentations in our habitats. So, conversely, from looking at debit projects, there's also ways to look at credit projects. So in Oregon, we can run the HQT and look at uplift and devise credit. Look at mitigation banks as one way to fund these mitigation projects. And so you have the in lieu fee, which is kind of a way that developers can pay in the state of Oregon, and we would do the mitigation responsibilities on ODFW. Mitigation banks, which we've got a couple set up in Oregon. I can talk to that later. And then also we have the kind of the traditional form of permittee responsible mitigation, or folks just doing it and we signing off on kind of the way that that has been done in the past. So all this is coordinated with all the other agencies. So BLM, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we've coordinated with the counties, very close coordination. So with our sage grouse mitigation program, we need to see a net conservation benefit for sage grouse. So we need to see that net uplift. So this is kind of that, that we want to see responsible economic development, but also, while promoting responsible, development in sage grouse habitat and promoting ecosystem health. And then I've said it again, but permitting and closely coordinated with other agencies. So the rules and the guiding documents, here's kind of the, on this slide, you can kind of see the Boardman to Hemingway project, which kind of was one of the first projects that kind of utilized our program, the Idaho power line from Idaho into Morrow County. And as you can see in that, it shows kind of some of the alternatives that snake through. We want to see, these projects avoid sage grouse habitat. We don't want to see them going right through core. We want to see them on the edges, co-locating whenever possible. But again, some of the new guiding documents, the 2015 sage grouse plan, the Greater Sage Grouse Habitat Operations and Administration Manual, that's basically what we use. That was finished in 2019, so probably needs some look at and updating that. And like Skylar said earlier in the presentation, DLCDs, the Goal 5 greater sage grouse rules, OAR 660, 023, 115 is kind of the guidance, that's the true guidance to the counties in how to operate in sage grouse habitat. And then we obviously have our Oregon administrative rules, 635, 140, 0 to 25. So with that, our recommendations are going to stay, very close to the same, as far as we're going to utilize best available science to inform the HQT, the habitat quantification tool. We're going to deal with developers and mitigation banks or conservation organizations. Similarly, running that tool. We want to cooperate early and often with permitting agencies to make sure that we can avoid and minimize, impacts of sage grouse if possible for all these development actions. We have worked really closely with SageCon and INR to develop communication resources like the development siting tool to help developers and landowners and other entities, basically understand the permitting process in sage grouse habitat. And then we are coordinating with mitigation banks and trying to promote that in the state of Oregon, so there is options for developers when they go to build some projects in sage grouse habitat. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it back over to either Michael or Skylar.
I can take it from here. Thank you, Greg. So we're almost there, folks. This is the second to last section here. And this is a new section where we wanted to put out some best management practices for things like translocating, trapping and marking. Whoops, is that right? Yeah, okay, yes. Trapping and marking, harvest management, and things like captive rearing, which we felt like we needed a position statement on. So first I'll touch on harvest management. So our strategy with sage grouse harvest has existed in a few different places, including the 5-year upland game bird hunting framework. But we want to be clear about how harvest permit allocation and open areas are going to work, especially with the new population model. Our intent is to stay very conservative and to keep permits in the same relative ballpark as they were before the population model, because we feel like our harvest management strategy has been very successful. We don't see our population responding negatively to harvest pressure because we have, I would argue, the most conservative model in the states that hunt sage grouse, and the returns on investment from the harvest is really invaluable as our hunters provide wing samples to us, and that informs things like our sex ratios, age ratios on an annual basis. We can tell from the wings whether a female was a successful nester or when was peak hatch, things like that. So it's really valuable information that comes at a very low cost, especially as we keep that harvest level, below 5% at the most of our projected fall populations. And really, in practice, our harvests are typically in the 3% range of our predicted fall populations. So like I said, we're going to stay very conservative. We're still kind of working through some kinks in the model to see how it interacts with our fall population estimation. So a little bit of a work in progress still. And this is not a hard and fast calculation, let me say. We always consider compounding factors when we set or when we propose our permit levels. Things like, is this an isolated population? Is it a place that has had recent fires? Are we seeing a problem with really poor hunter success? are the populations on a different trajectory than their neighbors, which we now have the USGS targeted annual warning system to help inform that. We call it the TAWS. You may hear that acronym. And so the takeaway is we want to keep harvest at a level where we're getting adequate wing samples to inform our population models and track our populations. We talked about effectiveness monitoring, and so tracking our demographics is critical to determining whether or not projects are successful on the ground. One really good example of that is the Warner unit, where we did large-scale juniper removals, and we are still seeing the effects of that in our wing returns as we have very high juvenile to adult ratios. So they're producing a lot more chicks there than they used to, and they continue to do so. And so that's a really great feedback loop that we wouldn't really be able to collect in any other way. Secondly, we put down some best management practices specific to translocation. Translocation is a really great tool for introducing or for maybe boosting our genetics in some of our isolated populations, like the Baker Pack. But we want to make sure we do this in a very responsible way, in a way that is informed and is going to hopefully be the most successful version of methodologies, and that does not impact our source population. And same thing for trapping and marking. We have a lot of research projects out there on the ground, and we want to make sure that anyone who's applying for a scientific collection permit considers very carefully the types of transmitters they're going to be using, the way that they're trapping and handling the birds. We want to demonstrate a lot of responsibility for these individual birds, and also make sure that the data coming out of these studies is not being impacted by the way that a transmitter is attached or its weight or that sort of thing. So it's best to have some BMPs down as we fund research projects and people are out there on the ground handling birds, etc. And then finally, we do put down a position statement about captive rearing. We don't see that as an issue in Oregon yet, but this issue has come up in other states and provinces. And if I was to summarize our position, it would be no, that we see captive rearing as distracting from the real problems that are out there on the landscape, which is the state of our habitat. And so we don't see a value in investing in captive rearing. You could go out and grow a bunch of sage grouse, turn them loose on a completely denuded landscape and say, hey, populations are doing great. And that is not the tack that ODFW wants to take. So that is the end of that chapter. And then just as a quick summary, we do have section 9, which will take all of the recommendations and summaries from the previous chapters, put them in one place for kind of easy reading and reference. And with that, I am going to call it good on this presentation. And oh no, that wound up in a weird place. I tried to put our link to our website in there, and it kind of went sideways. So anyway, we're real glad you stuck with us through this point. And at this point, we would love to take some questions. I assume that I know there's lots of super smart people in our audience who will have good questions for us that I'm going to have Skylar answer.
Thanks, everyone. As a reminder, you can use the Q&A function to ask your questions. We've got a couple in there already. One from Jennifer about sharing a link to the slide deck. Michael, you can correct me, but the recording for this meeting will be posted online. I'll post the link to that page. And if the slides are posted too, they will be in the same place.
Yes, and a reminder that the chat function is not working and your microphone's probably not working. And so you'll need to, if you have a question, just use the Q&A button to ask your question. So it looks like we have a question from Jennifer Brown. This one's for you, Greg. How successful have mitigation banks been?
Okay, yeah, so that's a good question, Jennifer. We have, like, I think, yeah, literally this week we got the first mitigation bank in Oregon signed and on our director's office. So, we haven't had time to kind of see how successful they are. Coincidentally, that bank, which was it takes multiple years to kind of set up a bank. The proponents of the bank, need to buy the property. They encumber it with different conservation easements, and then they start working on the uplift. So the restoration activities to get them the ability to sell credits. And so it's kind of a multi-year process. So this bank is in that northern Great Basin territory. It's around it's just east of Ontario, and so that bank was getting set up and actually sold some credits or sold some mitigation obligation to the Boardman to Hemingway project, and then last year half of it burned. So that's the thing. I mean, that's the reality of life now in sage grouse world, is that you have to address fire. So that bank is still operating. We just approved it. They're actively restoring those areas that burned. So yeah, I mean the theory with banks is that they're the best option for mitigation. Is that you have an entity that's basically working to buy a piece of property and restore it, and then be able to sell and trade credits. So hopefully that answers your question. I can share with you more offline if you have more.
All right, what else do we have? I see some people are raising their hands. Beth, I don't know if that's an option for us to call on people or not.
Yeah, it is. If folks want to just ask their question, we can unmute you. So if you do have a question, raise your hand and I will know who to unmute. I see Stu. So hang on, Stu. I'll go ahead and allow your mic. You might have to unmute yourself after I do that. Okay, Stu, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm wondering if there is currently translocation happening in Oregon.
Skylar, do you want to take that one?
There is not currently translocation happening in Oregon. We wanted to plan in the document so that if in the future there is a need to move birds to some of our struggling populations from more our robust populations, that we would have that set up. The Baker Pack would be a good example of where that might be happening in the future.
Looked like we had a couple other hands earlier, but I don't see them now. So if you had previously raised your hand, go ahead and do it again, and we will get your mic turned on.
Jim Greer, I know you had your hand up. What's on your mind? If you raise your hand, we can activate your mic. Okay.
All right, Barry, I will allow your mic. Give me just a second. Okay, go ahead, Barry. You just have to unmute yourself.
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for the presentation. I thought it was a really good job. I just kind of wanted to hear from one of you, maybe Skylar, about the new model and your thoughts. And, pretty big difference between the old model and the new model. And I don't doubt that the new model is a little more accurate, because I think we always thought there was a few more birds out there than what was being reported. But I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. Really, this is kind of the best of the best. Using repeated surveys, you can account for that detection probability that I mentioned before. So you can account for detection probability in a morning. If an observer shows up at sunrise or at 9 o'clock, you know that there are going to be many fewer birds at 9 o'clock than there were at sunrise. And if you account for multiple years of that, you're going to get higher estimates. In addition, it estimates during the survey season. So if you're surveying at the first day, March 15th, or if you're surveying during the peak of the season, April 15th or so, you're going to see more birds in April. Also, variations among seasons and how that might affect detection probability. So that's just one piece of it. In addition, what we didn't have in the previous model was that estimate of male attendance to leks. So we didn't have a rate in that previous model which said how many males are actually attending a lek in a given morning. And recent research has shown that it's actually only about half of the males in an area. So that 0.58 was applied in this new model. So that's a pretty significant difference between the previous and the new model, as well as accounting for those currently unknown leks on the landscape. We've been surveying for many years with the aerial surveys, and being able to account for those presently unknown leks using that survey history, we can also say that, hey, we probably don't know about all of the leks that are in Oregon, so we need to account for those somehow. And again, this was a USGS product. Those guys are the best at what they do. I have full faith in this model.
Hey, I thought I saw another hand that went down a bit ago. So again, if you've got a question, just make sure your hand is up so then I can see it to allow your mic.
While we're waiting for questions to pop up, I encourage you to visit our website. I realize that slide looks kind of funny. It's an easy Google though, ODFW sage grouse plan. And there you'll find a portal where you can provide comments. You'll see all of the chapters, the draft chapters that are published on the website, as well as the appendices. We're just waiting on one appendix. And then you'll have the whole collection. And so we encourage you to get in there and read through those draft chapters and then give us your feedback, because this is very much not a final product at this point. We're planning to present an update to the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission in August, and then we'll be coming back in September to seek approval for the plan. And so we have some time to incorporate ideas and comments, and we definitely want to hear from all of you. So please use that portal on our website to send us your thoughts.
And I've pasted that link into the Q&A for easy access.
Okay, other thoughts, questions? Of course, you can always contact us directly or through the website if you don't want to ask your question on a public forum. This presentation has been recorded, and we'll also place that on the website. So, you know, if you know of someone who wanted to be here but couldn't, then certainly just, you know, they can rewatch this on the website. And again, there, you can also provide comments directly to the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission, either in written or verbally at the commission meeting. So again, we love public participation in this process, and we want you guys all along for the ride. Okay. Beth, I think maybe we've solved all the problems of sage grouse management here today.
Looks like it. I see no other questions. So thanks everyone for your attendance.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.